The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see the road when my headlights caught her, limping along the shoulder, clutching a boy to her chest. She looked like she'd run from hell itself, soaked to the bone, eyes wide with terror. I pulled over, not knowing that one small act of kindness would drag me into a storm of secrets I never could have imagined. The storm had rolled in fast, sweeping over the dark highway like an uninvited guest. Daniel gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, wipers screeching as they struggled to clear the torrents of rain hammering the windshield. His 6-year-old daughter, Emily, was curled in the back seat under her favorite quilt, her small face pressed to the window, eyes closed in the deep trust of a child who believes her father can drive through anything. Daniel's body ached from another long shift at the garage. He told himself, as he often did, that the long hours were worth it if it meant Emily had shoes that fit, books for school, and the occasional ice cream cone after church on Sundays. Life was tight, but he had learned to swallow his pride and carry on without complaint. That was when he saw them, two figures on the roadside, half swallowed by the sheets of rain. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, a branch, maybe, or shadows bending under the headlights. But as his truck drew closer, he caught the glint of wet skin, the tremble of movement. A woman, limping heavily, clutching a boy to her chest. They looked like they had been standing there for hours, the rain flattening their clothes against thin bodies. Daniel's pulse quickened. He could have kept driving, telling himself it wasn't safe to stop for strangers, especially with Emily asleep in the back. But something in the woman's posture, the way her arms locked around the boy as if the world itself were trying to rip him away, made his foot ease off the gas. He pulled over, tires splashing against the shoulder. He rolled down the passenger window. Cold air and rain rushed in, carrying the woman's ragged breathing. Her face was pale beneath bruises, lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, just don't take us back." The boy pressed closer to her, his eyes wide with a terror Daniel had only seen once before, when the doctors had told him his wife's cancer had spread too far. He swallowed hard. He didn't know who they were, didn't know what trouble they carried, but he knew fear when it looked back at him. "Get in," he said, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "You'll both get sick out here." The woman hesitated, as though expecting a trap, but when she looked into Daniel's eyes lined by years of quiet endurance, she seemed to find enough trust to climb in. The boy clung to her, silent. Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror, where Emily stirred and blinked sleepily at the newcomers, then smiled softly, as if welcoming them without words. As Daniel pulled back onto the road, the rain still roaring, he had no way of knowing how deeply this choice would carve into the rest of his life. All he knew was that kindness had once saved him, and now it was his turn to pass it on. The house smelled faintly of motor oil and wood smoke, the scent of Daniel's life as a mechanic and single father. He set an extra pot of soup on the stove that night, glancing often toward the worn couch where the strangers huddled under a quilt. The storm outside had quieted, leaving behind the steady drip of rain from the eaves, but inside the small home, silence pressed against the walls like an unwelcome guest. Emily, still half asleep, had toddled out of her room clutching her stuffed bear and simply placed it on the boy's lap before crawling into her father's arms. Daniel had kissed her hair, marveling at her instinctive kindness. Children didn't weigh people by their pasts, only by the fear in their eyes. The woman, who later told him her name was Sarah, cradled the soup bowl with trembling hands. The steam rose against her bruised face, making her eyes glisten. Her son, Ethan, barely spoke, but he clung to the quilt as if warmth itself might vanish if he let go. Daniel didn't push. He knew too well that some stories required time to find their way out. But over the next few days, pieces of Sarah's life slipped free, carried on hesitant words when Emily wasn't listening, when Ethan was asleep, when the house was quiet enough to hold confessions. She had married into a wealthy family. At first, they had embraced her, proud of the union, proud of the child born into their name. But everything changed the night her husband's heart gave out. Grief turned cold, and coldness sharpened into cruelty. They called her weak, a burden, an opportunist. Ethan, instead of being cherished as the last piece of their son, became to them an unwelcome reminder of loss. Her hands shook as she described the night it turned violent. The brother-in-law's slap, the way Ethan had cried out, the way she had gathered him up and fled into the darkness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Daniel listened, jaw tight, the memory of his wife's hospital bed rising unbidden. He remembered how people disappeared when things grew hard, how silence could cut deeper than cruelty. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't need it. He believed her because her voice carried the weight of someone who had stopped hoping to be believed. When Sarah trailed off, staring into the quilt as though the stitches held her shame, Daniel said quietly, "You're safe here. No one's coming through that door unless I let them." She looked up, startled by the firmness in his tone, then nodded once, as though a fragile thread had been tied between them. Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we staying?" Daniel crouched to meet his eyes, the boy's fear a mirror of Emily's grief years ago. "For as long as you need," he said. In that moment, Daniel didn't think of consequences or questions he hadn't asked. He only knew this. Sometimes broken people needed a place to breathe before they could stand again, and he was willing to offer it. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither Daniel nor Sarah had expected. What began as a shelter from the storm became something sturdier, something almost like family. Emily was the first to bridge the distance. She had the fearless generosity of a child, the kind that believed sharing toys could mend anything. On the second morning, she marched into the living room with a box of crayons and laid them on the floor between her and Ethan. He hesitated, his small shoulders tense, as though even this simple act carried risk. But when she drew a lopsided sun with a face and handed him the yellow crayon, he allowed himself to sit down. Soon, the paper was filled with bright, chaotic shapes. Emily's messy stars beside Ethan's surprisingly neat houses and tiny trees. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway, sipping his coffee, the sight tugging at something in him. For months, the house had been too quiet. Emily's laughter had dimmed after her mother's passing, replaced by questions Daniel couldn't always answer. Now, hearing her giggle at Ethan's shy smile, he felt a spark he thought he'd lost, the hum of a home where joy could live. Sarah moved cautiously through the space, as though she were afraid of disturbing the fragile peace. She offered to help with meals, folding laundry, sweeping the floor. Daniel noticed how her eyes softened when Emily tugged at her hand, how Ethan's posture eased when Sarah's arm rested protectively across his back. Yet shadows lingered in her expression, flickers of fear she tried to bury when she thought no one was looking. One evening, Daniel came home to find the three children, because that's what Sarah seemed in that moment, a child relearning how to belong, huddled around the small table playing checkers. Ethan's brow was furrowed in concentration while Emily cheered him on, and Sarah actually laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. Daniel stood in the doorway longer than he needed, unwilling to break the moment. Later that night, when he tucked Emily into bed, she whispered, "Daddy, can Ethan stay forever?" Her eyes were wide, hopeful. Daniel smoothed her hair, his throat tightening. "We'll see, Pumpkin. For now, let's just be glad they're here." He turned off the light, but the question stayed with him. For the first time in years, his home didn't feel like a place of loss. It felt like a beginning. Peace has a way of feeling fragile when you've known too much loss. As the days slipped into weeks, the warmth of Daniel's home began to knit small wounds shut, but Sarah's eyes still carried storms of their own. At night, when she thought no one noticed, she double-checked the locks on the doors and peeked through the curtains at the quiet street. Daniel caught her once, standing in the dark with only the glow of the porch light outlining her frame. She jumped when he spoke her name. "They won't find you here," he said softly, careful not to startle her further. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know them. Power like theirs doesn't let go. They can reach into places you wouldn't believe." Her hand trembled as she brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, though the room was warm. Daniel wanted to argue, to tell her that his small town was safe, that no one with tailored suits and gleaming cars cared enough to drive down these muddy back roads. But he held his tongue. He recognized the kind of fear that sank deep. It was not a visitor, but a tenant, and no amount of reassurance could evict it overnight. Ethan, too, carried shadows. Daniel noticed how the boy flinched at loud noises, how he grew restless when a strange car drove past the house. And yet, beneath that fear was a mind that shone. Ethan devoured the books Daniel pulled down from dusty shelves, asked questions about engines while following Daniel into the garage, and beat Emily at checkers with quiet strategy. He was a boy with the makings of something bright, but brightness dimmed when fear hovered nearby. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah confessed more. She sat at the table with her hands clasped so tightly Daniel thought her knuckles might crack. "It's not just their hatred of me," she whispered. "It's Ethan. He is his father's son, and by law, he carries what they want. Money. Control. They would rather erase us than accept us. That's why I ran." Daniel's chest tightened. He had always thought of wealth as something distant, something that belonged to people on magazine covers or in the stories Emily sometimes pointed at in the checkout aisle. He saw only the woman before him, her voice shaking, and the boy asleep in the other room. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You did what you had to do. Whatever they're after, it doesn't change the fact that Ethan's just a kid who deserves peace. And I'll do what I can to give him that." Sarah's eyes welled, though she quickly turned away. Gratitude and dread mingled there, unspoken. She knew safety was temporary, like a candle flickering in a draft. And Daniel, lying awake later, listening to the storm of wind against the roof, began to wonder if her fears might be more than shadows. It was a Sunday afternoon when the quiet of Daniel's modest street was broken. The sky was pale, the kind of washed-out blue that promised spring but hadn't yet delivered warmth. Daniel was fixing a loose hinge on the front porch door when the sound of polished tires crunching gravel made him look up. The car didn't belong. It was sleek and black, its body reflecting the neighborhood like a mirror. Even before the door opened, Daniel felt his stomach knot. He'd seen cars like this only on television or parked outside banks in the city. They didn't stop on streets where kids rode rusty bikes and mechanics lived paycheck to paycheck. A man stepped out, tall and trim in a charcoal suit that hadn't seen a wrinkle in its life. He carried an envelope under one arm, as though it weighed more than metal. Daniel stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and waited. The man removed his hat with practiced formality. "Mr. Harris?" Daniel's first instinct was to shield the doorway behind him. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The man's eyes flicked briefly past him toward the house before he answered. "I'm looking for Mrs. Sarah Carter." His voice was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that delivered news people didn't always want to hear. "My name is Mr. Collins. I represent the Carter estate." Daniel felt a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Behind him, the screen door creaked, and Sarah appeared, her face draining of color at the name. Collins inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Carter, forgive my intrusion. You and your son have been gone for weeks. The board has been most anxious. Ethan Carter is the sole heir to Carter Enterprises. His absence has raised considerable concern." He held out the envelope. "This contains documents verifying his inheritance. I've been tasked to ensure his welfare and presence at the next board session." For a heartbeat, the world went still. Daniel's hammer slipped from his fingers and hit the porch with a dull thud. Ethan, who had wandered to the doorway at the sound of voices, stared up with wide eyes. "Heir?" he repeated, as though the word were in another language. Sarah's lips parted, but no sound came. She finally managed, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this. I wanted peace for him, not a fortune that would cost him his childhood." Collins's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "Mrs. Carter, the law is clear. No matter the circumstances, Ethan is the rightful successor. Attempts to deny or alter this have no standing." His gaze darkened slightly. "And there have indeed been attempts." Daniel's chest tightened. The vague threat Sarah had whispered now stood on his porch in flesh and blood. The simplicity of soup and quilts was gone. They were standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. Ethan's small voice broke the silence. "Does this mean they'll come for us again?" Daniel crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. He didn't have answers, but he could give the boy one truth. "It means whatever comes, you won't face it alone." The days after Mr. Collins's visit felt like a door had been flung open, letting in a storm that would not close again. Daniel's quiet neighborhood was no longer quiet. Strange cars lingered at the end of the street. Camera flashes sometimes broke through the blinds at night. Emily grew nervous, tugging at Daniel's sleeve whenever she spotted a man in a suit on the sidewalk. Inside, the house was different too. Phone calls came at odd hours, voices Daniel didn't recognize offering money, influence, protection. But there was always a condition: Sarah stepping aside, Ethan being taken care of by those who claimed they knew what was best. Each time, Daniel hung up without a word. though his hand stayed clenched long after the receiver clicked down. Sarah moved through the house like a shadow, her worry sharp enough to cut the air. She kept Ethan close, but the boy could sense the change. His questions came more often now, asked in the small hours when the house was dark. One night, Daniel woke to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the chessboard he'd set up earlier. The boy didn't look up when he asked, "Will you still want me here if I'm rich?" The words struck Daniel harder than any threat from a lawyer or a boardroom. He pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. "Ethan," he said, his voice low but firm, "family isn't about what's in a bank. It's about who stands beside you when everything else falls apart." He leaned closer, cupping the boy's face in his calloused hands. "You'll always have a place here. Money doesn't change that. Nothing does." Ethan blinked rapidly, as if fighting tears, then nodded. For the first time in days, his small shoulders eased. But outside, the pressure mounted. Reporters shouted questions from across the street. Men in suits slipped notes under the door with offers and warnings in the same breath. Daniel doubled the locks and kept Emily home from school more than once, his heart twisting at her disappointed sighs. The house, once filled with laughter and crayons scattered on the table, now felt like a fortress under siege. And yet, within its walls, bonds were hardening. Against the roar of greed and intimidation, the small family found a sharper clarity that their strength wasn't in wealth, but in choosing each other. The courthouse loomed tall and unyielding, its stone walls casting long shadows across the steps. Daniel had never been inside a courtroom before. His life had been measured in oil changes, school drop-offs, and grocery lists. Yet here he was, walking beside Sarah and Ethan, feeling the weight of a fight that had little to do with him and yet had become inseparable from his own life. Inside, the air was hushed but tense, the kind of silence that carried judgment even before the gavel fell. Sarah sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Daniel sat just behind her, Emily's photograph tucked in his wallet like a talisman, reminding him of why he needed to be steady. Across the aisle, Sarah's in-laws arrived like a procession of entitlement. Perfect suits, polished shoes, faces set in expressions of superiority. They didn't look at Sarah, they looked through her, as though she were a nuisance rather than family. Their lawyers shuffled papers with the confidence of someone used to winning. The proceedings began. Witnesses were called. Mr. Collins laid out documents proving Ethan's rightful claim to his father's estate. Sarah's voice trembled as she recounted the abuse, the rejection, the night she fled. She did not embellish. She did not need to. The bruises, the fear etched into her son's small face, were evidence enough. At one point, the defense tried to paint Sarah as unstable, unfit, an opportunist clinging to wealth. Daniel felt his fists clench, but he stayed silent, his presence a quiet anchor. When Sarah's brother-in-law was asked under oath whether he had ever struck her, his eyes darted, and the hesitation spoke louder than denial. Ethan was spared from testifying, though the judge's gaze lingered on him often, as if measuring the boy's quiet dignity against the noise of greed surrounding him. When the final arguments closed, the gavel struck like thunder. The judge's voice was steady, cutting through the tension. The law is clear. Ethan Carter is the sole heir of the Carter estate. Any attempt to remove him from that position is hereby denied. Furthermore, the documented abuse presented today is deeply troubling. Custody and guardianship remain with his mother, Sarah Carter, without interference. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Sarah's shoulders sagged, as though she had been holding her breath for years and finally exhaled. Daniel leaned forward, placing a steady hand on her arm. Ethan turned in his seat, his eyes searching for Daniel's, and found reassurance in the quiet nod he received. Justice had been served. Yet the true victory was not in the inheritance restored, but in the truth spoken aloud. Sarah and Ethan were no longer shadows fleeing in the rain. They had stood, and they had been heard. The storm had passed, though traces of it lingered in the form of gossip columns and unanswered phone calls. But inside Daniel's home, something steadier had taken root. The walls that once echoed with absence now held the sounds of children's laughter, the clatter of dishes at dinner time, and the quiet hum of belonging. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and rose, Daniel stepped onto the porch. Sarah stood beside him, her cardigan pulled close, watching Ethan and Emily chase each other across the yard. Their giggles carried through the warm air, rising above the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. She turned to Daniel, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You saved us when you had nothing to gain," she said, her voice breaking with sincerity. "That makes you richer than any billionaire." Daniel's throat tightened. He had never thought of himself as a savior. He was just a man who worked long hours, who fixed cars and tried to raise his daughter with kindness. Yet here they were, two children playing in the fading light, a woman slowly piecing herself back together, and a home that felt alive again. Ethan ran toward him suddenly, clutching Emily's hand. "Look," he shouted breathless. "We found a butterfly." He opened his palms to reveal the fragile creature, its wings trembling in the last rays of sunlight. Emily grinned up at her father, her cheeks flushed with joy. Daniel crouched down, wrapping an arm around both children as they leaned close. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. The butterfly lifted, wings catching the glow, before fluttering into the sky. Ethan's eyes followed it, wide with wonder, and then he looked up at Daniel. "Will we always be a family?" the boy asked quietly. Daniel pulled him close, ruffling his hair. "Always," he said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. Sarah joined them, her hand slipping gently into Daniel's. The four of them stood together as the sun slid behind the horizon, a modest home silhouetted against the glow. No inheritance, no empire, no fortune could measure the weight of that moment. What they had built together was stronger than any wealth. It was love, chosen freely, forged in hardship, and held tight in the warmth of a promise.